Thank you. Thank you. Can you all hear me? All right. Cool. So, first of all, I'd like to introduce myself. So, who am I? He just said my name. I'm Raphael Rau, also known as Silverwing in the internet. I'm a 3D generalist and a compositing artist based in Germany, Ludwigsburg. I do mostly full CG animations and stills, and also a lot of visualizations. So that's what I do for a living. If you want to follow me up, you can go to silverwing-vfx.de and go and see my work on my website, or follow me at Twitter. I said yesterday that I don't post food pictures, so if you want to follow someone who posts food pictures, then I'm not the one to follow. All right, so to have a good overview over what I do, I just show you my reel. Unfortunately, it's from 2014, and I haven't had the time to update it now, but it's still very good, I think, so I'll just play it for you. Here you go. All right. So again, the shout out to Redstone Music, who did the nice soundtrack for my reel. So thank you. Okay, let's go back to the presentation. So keys. Keys, what is this? Keys is an experimental short film I did just 1 month ago, and it's about 2 minutes and 30 seconds long. It is created entirely in Cinema 4D R18. So you might think, how is this possible? R18 is just available for a couple of days now. But fortunately, I'm a beta tester, so I have access to R18 earlier. And what better to create a project in a software that you have to test a live project. So I created it in Cinema 4D. I rendered it entirely in Octane Render. And also a very point I want to make sure gets out is the music really helped the project to come together. So thanks a lot, Simon, for doing the music, the awesome soundtrack. Right, so the guys in the internet, if you want to see it in high quality, just go to vimeo.com/Silverwing. You can find keys there. And while we watch it here, you can watch it on Vimeo in better quality, I guess. All right, so let's screen keys. So this is the short I created. All right. So, and as there is no short film without some thank yous to some people, you have to go through that. So, thanks, of course, Simon Damberg for the awesome soundtrack. He really got life into the animation. Then, thanks to Thomas Fieler. He is a colleague. I'm sitting with him in one office, so we have a shared office. We're both freelancers, and he has some useful tips and also the GPU power. Then, of course, Sebastian Pienta, thank you for additional modeling. So he modeled the log you've seen in the short. And Cornelius Demrich, I don't know if you know him. He did the awesome picture with the astronaut in the telephone booth. So we normally just chatting with each other, helping out each other on our artworks. So thanks a lot for looking out for me. Then Ahmed Oktar is a very important person. He is the programmer of the Cinema 4D Octane plugin, and he's very devoted and very good in what he's doing. So without him, there wouldn't be keys, because I use Cinema 4D, and I had the opportunity, of course, through him to use Octane. So thank you, Ahmed. And finally, I would like to thank Maxon for having me here. All right, I just noted some facts. So normally you're interested in some facts around animations. So rendering times. So rendering, I've measured that on just one GPU, on one graphics card, because Octane is a graphics card renderer. And it took around 5 minutes to 60 minutes on one card per frame. So for the lock scene, it took 5 minutes, and for the pillow scene, it took 60 minutes. So you might think 60 minutes is a bit long per frame, but it was only rendered on one card to test it. And on the other hand, I rendered depth of field, motion blur, GI, and heavy volumetrics within that frame. And it only took 16 minutes, so it's not that bad. So, of course, we had more than one card. So I had 6 workstations with overall 14 CPUs rendering on that. So if I also all got this in one cluster to render on one frame, it didn't take 60 minutes anymore, but 5 minutes, something like that. So overall render time for the movie was 5 to 6 days whole. So if I would have to render it again, it would render 5 to 6 days. So production time was roughly 1.5 months. I had some jobs in between there, so it's give and take, but roughly 1.5 months. So software use, you already know that I used Cinema 4D, then Octane Render to render it. I used Substance Designer. I used it primarily for the floor in the pillow scene, but I used it on other objects too. Then After Effects for comp work, and Premiere for editing. All right, forget that I'm on Windows 10 where I can switch desktops. All right, so there's this thing I also want to show, and let's turn down the sound on this one. So I did this thing where I split the screen in 3 equal parts, rotating, and you can see that there's one view with a wireframe, so the raw 3D data, then there's a raw render, and then there's the final result. And with this film, I wanted to make an experiment, of course, so that's why the title is Visual Experiment. And one part of the experiment was, how close can I come with just a render to the final result? So in most of the scenes, I rendered everything in one go. I rendered the volume, I rendered the particles, I rendered motion blur, depth of field. Nothing in there is made in comp. The only thing I did in comp most of the time was color correction. So everything you see is more or less the final result as it came out of the render. In some specific scenes, I took a separate path for the volume, but in most scenes, I rendered everything in one go. Of course, this might not be advised if you work for clients because they have changes and you don't want to render everything again. But as I was my own client on this project, I could do something like that and really try to get as close as possible to the final result. You can see in the 3D there are particles in there, so I didn't use trapcode particular or anything. I just scattered objects around in the scene using MoGraph, and then just have them have like a slightly translucent material, and then render them with the Octane camera, with motion blur, with depth of field, and anything. All right. So yesterday, if you've seen my presentation yesterday, I showed you some shading inside of Octane, how I did the keys. Today, I am showing you some other stuff. So I asked online what most people wanted to see here, and the answer that came back mostly was the spider webs. So they're really interested in the spider webs. So I will show that. But before that, I will show how I did the explosion of the key. I hope you still can remember that. If not, I just have this small animation here. So that's the explosion of the key I did. It's using the new Voronoi fracture tool of Maxon that they built in the R18, and some particles with X particles. I like X particles because you get the velocity of the object to the particles when the object is moving, and therefore you get like the spread out effect that comes very natural and comes close to a real explosion. So before we dive into the more complex stuff with the spline dynamics, I'll just go over how I did the explosion. So to do that, I'm just going to open the key explosion pure. So that's just one model of the key I did. And it's an SDS model, so let's just display the wireframe real quick. Nothing special. So let's go back to our normal view. And to break it apart, it's very easy. So normally you just go to MoGraph, to the Voronoi fracture, and just drag it in there, and done. You have the effect. So right now, of course, it's doing nothing if I play the timeline because there's no dynamics on it. So for my effect, I didn't want to have gravity in there, so let's just get a dynamics effect in there. Let's see, where is it? Here, rigid body. Of course, if I do that, it will fall down. So what I want to do is just go into my dynamic setting and turn the gravity to 0, and then have a cube in my scene to push the key towards one direction. So let's turn it 45 degrees, and let's make this get back there. There we go, something like that. And I'll just animate that cube right now, so let's just go within 25 frames, something like that. So it will push the key forward. Now, of course, I need to add a collider body to that. So that's something I set up for the explosion of the key. And of course, I made the cube invisible. Now, it's as easy as that to get something out of Cinema 4D, but for me, that setup didn't work out because the Voronoi fracture is doing very uniform surfaces on the brakes. I want to have something more that looks like as iron would break. You don't get like this very chopped off look. So I tried to figure out a way to do that. And the best solution I could come up with is to cluster together multiple fracturings. So what I did is just, I did go into the fracture object, and then let's see, where is it? The source particles where I use to fracture my key. So I just turned that up to a higher amount, maybe 500. Maybe that's a bit too high. Maybe 250. Let's make it half 500. It's okay. So I get more detailed shatter pieces. So for the next step, I needed to make the object editable. So I just made it editable, and somehow it didn't work. Let's just go ahead one more time. Oh, somehow well, that's the pleasure of making a live demo. Things go wrong. So let's do it again. Now it worked. So the thing I've done was just going to the lasso selection and then selecting some parts and then grouping them together in one null. Then taking the null outside of the group and doing that a couple of times. Here we go. Also take that out, making it invisible. One more time. So for this process, we can make them visible again now. For this process, if you turn off one fracturing part, you get a more detailed fracturing selection. So it looks more like metal when it breaks. Of course, I used Octane to make a displacement texture on that, so it looks even more detailed. But now I'm just selecting all of those parts and grouping it down to one object. And then you already know what I will do. I'll just create a dynamic simulations just using those objects. So here we go. Where's it? Here you go. So I'll just move those all into one null. Then creating a dynamic simulation again on top here, rigid body. And make sure the inherit is set to apply tag to children. And then if I did everything right, it should work. Yay, okay. So the only other thing I could do is set this to start off when there's a collision, because right now you can see that it's already falling apart before the cube hits the key. So what I could do is just go to the dynamics and trigger it on collision. So here we go. Now it stays intact until the cube hits it. And that's basically how I did the explosion for the key in my short. So now to something you all look forward to, hopefully, the spider webs. So let's close that down and open the prepared scene for the spider webs. So in this scene, I just want to create spider webs between those two keys you can see here. So let's go outside of the camera here. And actually, it's rather simple. Everything's rather simple. So I'm afraid I will show you that, and you're like, what? That's all to it? Oh, I thought it was more complicated. But anyway, I will show you. So I'll just take the pen, the spline pen, and then I turn on the snapping tool. And I don't want to snap to vertices, I only want to snap to polygon faces, so I turn that off. And then I just go here and snap the spline to some locations of my objects. And I don't want to continue, so I press escape. And I do that a couple of times. So let's get another spider web from here to here, and another one from down here maybe to up here. So here we go. So maybe I just made them intersect. Let's just see. Well, okay. So the advantage of doing that by snapping, you can just grab a point and just move it around, and it will stay at the surface. It's quite nice. And it's also quite fast. So, of course, those don't look like spider webs, and they are also not dynamic. So what I need to make them dynamic are more points, because the dynamics are calculated on the vertices of the spline. Now, and the only vertices on the splines are at the position where they shouldn't move. So there's a very practical feature here. If you go to Mesh and go to Commands, you can subdivide everything. That also works for polygons, but I just use it for splines. And I want to have more subdivisions than 5, so I type in 15. And you get more subdivisions that you can create dynamics on. But the subdivisions right now are not uniform, and I like them to be uniform. So what I could do, just go back one step and then create a linear spline with no in-between points, and then do the whole thing again. We're having some interference from the booth there next to us, so sorry for the noise. Okay, let's go to Mesh, to Commands, and then go to Subdivide. And as I already have 15 subdivisions in there, you can see it works. Okay, so let's make the spline more visible by turning it white. All right, so you can see the spline better. Now, there's a very easy way to create spline dynamics, and actually it's just going to the hair tags and add that one node here, that one tag. So you get spline dynamics. So if I play that, they will just fall down. Of course, we want to keep the splines at the keys. So there are two methods to do that. One method that I used is a little bit simpler, and you use that if you don't have any other movement than the splines in your scene. So in my short film, the keys aren't moving, so I could just fix those points to the position they are. So let's do that first. And there's, in the properties, you can just set a fixed position, and now we get the spline dynamics we're looking for. But if I move one key away, of course, the points are not fixed to the key, but to thin air, so they will stay at this point. So the more natural approach is to parent the points to the object. So I just go to the hair tags again, and there's a constraint tag, and you can use that to constrain the splines to an object. Sorry, I deleted the simulation tag, so let's just create a simulation tag here too. Okay, so I've selected the points that are should be constrained to that key, and it's easy as dragging that key in there and pushing set. Now I accidentally also had selected those points. Those are all now constrained to that key. We don't want that, so I only want to select those points and then hit release. It's not working. Live demo here again. So release everything. Okay, now we are good. And then set this to that key. And of course, we need to do that for the other key too. So I just grab another, here we go, another constraint, drag in the first key, and select those points and set it to this key. So let's just see if that works by adding a vibrate tag. Yeah, seems to work. So now we're having constrained our splines to a moving object. Now there's one little thing that you notice. If you look at this point, it's lagging behind one frame. So the movement of the key is just one frame ahead. And this has something to do with Cinema 4D working the hierarchy from top to bottom. So if you have your animation or your simulation at the top, that's what calculated first, and afterwards the movement of the key is calculated, so it cannot be written back to the simulation until the next cycle in the next frame. So the easy fix is just to move it underneath what animation you have in the scene. So if I play it now, you can see it's not lagging anymore. It stays fixed. All right. So let's just get rid of the vibrate tag here, and let's do. Let's create something that looks more like a spider web. So obviously this is very straight, and I don't want to have straight lines in my render, so I just want to relax them a little bit. So there's also a very easy thing. I just let the simulation run till frame 100 in this case, and then I go to my spline tag, and then I just set the state to initial. So that will make the spline keep that way at frame 0. So if I hit that and go back to frame 0, they are now in this initial state. So the other thing I did was I didn't only create like straight splines, I create intersections of spider webs in between. So that's also very easy. So let's just go back to the spline pan and just create an intersection here. So I'll just enable snap to vertices, because I want to snap to some vertices on the spline here. So I just choose maybe that connection and I press escape. So I just created a spline where this is connected to the vertice on this master spline, I will call it. So right now I'll just go ahead and go through the same process again, creating a subdivision. And right now it's just fine with 5 subdivisions. Oh, and again, if you're wanting to subdivide that in a uniform manner, just set this to linear. So here we go, mesh, subdivide, 5. All right. So this time I will not simulate the gravity first. I will just try to get it in there by hand. So something like that. That looks okay. So basically, it's just repeating the same steps over and over again. So first of all, because of the order of the calculation of Cinema 4D, I want to move that spline below the other spline, because it gets its information where this point is based on the simulation that's running in that spline. So you want not to break that, because then you get a lag in your animation again. So here we go. And then, of course, I can just copy this simulation tag here, and then on top of that, I will just add, if I'll find it, here we go, a constraint. And you already know what to do. Just drag in the responsible key, and then choose the point and set that to the key. And actually, what Cinema 4D is doing is normally it searches the nearest point on the object to constrain it to. But with the key, it's inside of an SDS object, so it doesn't work like that. So you can see all the constraints are created from the center point of the key. But the spline isn't in any object, so it can access the spline points. So long story short, I'll just drag in my master spline, select the point, and constrain it to the spline. And now it has constrained this point to the vertice that's closest to this point on the master spline, which is the exact location. So let's just make that visible also. And if I run the animation now, you should get the effect that the spline is connected to the other spline moving with the dynamics. Okay, cool. So right now, we are done with our setup, with our rigging, but there's like nothing going on here. So like the splines fall down a bit, they look rather heavy, and then they stop moving. So that's not very interesting for an animation. So what I do is, first of all, lower the gravity, because spider webs are very light. You can do that another way, but for my simulation, I just lower the gravity because it's the easiest fix for me. So instead of minus 9.81, I just type minus 0.5. And of course, this makes the spline move even less, so I have to do something to create a dynamic sense of air movement in there. So what I did was just going into the simulation, simulate particles, and create a wind object. Here we go. So the wind object, I'll just move it to the side, because it doesn't matter where it is in the scene. The only thing that matters if you don't have a fall off is where it's pointing. So right now you still cannot see any effect on that. That's because you have to drag it in the forces here. Here we go. And now you can see the wind effect is influencing the splines. Now this is also looking rather weird. You don't get you might get spider webs in the outside doing that, but it's on the attic in my scene where there's very little air movement, so I want to just get the feel right. So I'll just go inside of the object here and turn down the wind speed to 0.1. And this gives me a little more subtle result. But I'm missing something here. Like normally if there's like turbulences in the air, there's like this subtle movement inside of the web. So fortunately, there's something like turbulence in the wind effector, so I turn that up by 50%. And You can imagine that like a 3D noise field and moving, pushing, and pulling the air around. So right now, the noise field is very large, and so you don't get very much difference in between the start and the end of the spline. So if I just make it rather small, you can see we get the effect we are after, having this spider webs floating in the air. All right, so the next step would be if I go here and have a little more close-up view, you can still see that the edges are rather checkered. So you see the different vertices of the splines, and we don't want that. So what I do is just go inside our spline, set it from linear to cubic, because the cubic interpolation lets the vertice of the spline stay at its position. It doesn't move the vertice. And then, of course, we have to use some interpolation. And I'll just reduce the points here. And if I go back to our view, you can see that it's looking much smoother now. So the things I do now are very basic. So normally, every Cinema 4D beginner does that. So to add visibility to a spline, you already know what to do. You just add a sweep NURBS. So I'll just do that for both our splines. Here we go. Sorry. Sweep. And then you need to define a radius. And I don't take the circle very often, because the circle is very hard to manage the subdivisions in there. So what I normally do is create an end side. Because with the end side, you get a number to define the subdivisions within the circle. So it's much more controllable, for me at least. So let's go and make this 0.1 in diameter, and then just place it inside of the sweep NURBS. So you can see we got a visible spline now, doing our dynamic thing. The other thing is, of course, I want to increase the sides of the end side, so let's go with 16 to get a more rounder shape. And also, of course, very obviously, that's much too big for a spider web. So let's set it more to a 0.007 or something. Here we go. That's more like a spider web. So, and I think most of you already guessed how I distributed the dust on there. So it's just a MoGraph setup with a cloner cloning dust on there, but I still will show it. Here we go. Just having a MoGraph, cloner. Now again, for the third time, this is a dynamic simulation. If you don't want the clones to lag, like the spline is moving every frame and you want the clones to stick on there, just move the cloner at the last dynamic object in the history, or in the material, in the object stack. All right, so of course we are choosing a object to clone on for the cloner, and that would be the spline. As we have two splines, of course, we have to use two cloners. I'm just clone on the master spline right now. You can imagine how it looks with the other spline. I don't want to use the vertices to clone on, but just the surface, and then I'll define a number of clones I will distribute across the surface. So I'll go with 500 in this case. I rendered everything with Octane, and the good thing with Octane, it recognizes render instances. So it helps you to get also the scene data faster to the card, and also within the card, it's faster than having just normal objects floating around. So I just take render instances. And I already prepared something. So I normally distribute dust on the scene. If you look, I will show the short film later again. And if you have a close look at the keys, there's some hairs and stuff like that fallen on there. So that's what I do to make it more realistic most of the time. I'll just distribute dust particles over everything. So this is what I do with the spider webs also. having this kind of stuff distributed over everything. So you can see those are hairs and like dust particulates. All right, so those are distributed very uniformly right now. So let's do a plane effector to first of all scale them down. Let's have a plane effector. And the plane effector moves them, but that's not what we want. We want to scale them. So I'll just turn off the position, turn on the scaling, and scale them by minus 0.5. So we have a smaller, we just decrease the size of every clone. And then, of course, we want to distribute them a bit more randomly. So I go to the effectors again and choose a random effector. Here we go. Let's move that to our stack here. Hopefully it has assigned. No, let's just assign the random effector. Of course, the random effector also affects the position, but I only want to affect the size and the rotation. So let's go with minus 0.5 here. So we get variance between 1 and 0.5, minus 0.5 in the scale. And let's just scale it a couple degrees so we get a rather random distribution. Now there's one thing I forgot. Things in nature aren't uniform. They're they have variance. So what I did also with the splines, I got into the spline object and to the sweep NURBS, and there's this details rollout. And you can set the scale of the spline by this parameter here. So what I did was just, just randomized the spline width over the length of the spline a bit randomly, so you get this more broken up look that then looks much more realistic in the render. And the good thing is you can just copy that and paste it to the other spline. Here we go. Okay, now last but not least, I looked at close-up photos that represent like thin spider webs, and they're transparent or they're translucent. They're not white. So let me get Octane Render into play. So if I render that right now, the spider webs are white, and they look okay, but they don't look like that. Like there's another step you can take to make them look more realistic. So what I did was I just used a glass material, come on, show up, and put that on the spider webs. But spider webs are not made of glass either. So what I did was made the glass more rough. So there's this roughness parameter where you can slide. And my philosophy is, sorry, that's reflection, not the roughness. My philosophy is that everything in nature has some variance. So what I did for the final, let me just search the roughness here, the first one, of course. Here we go. That's what I wanted to show. So everything has variance. So luckily, if you do splines with Cinema 4D, they already come with UV sets. So I did this other material where I used the texture to break up the roughness into rougher parts and almost transparent parts. And I'll just take that material instead of the one I just created because it looks better. And then I'll just show you in render. So if I now render this, and actually it's quite interesting how thin you have to make those spider webs to actually look realistic. So I had a very small number in there in the circumference of the spider webs, and still when I had the render, I initially thought they would look realistic, but after a couple of frames I noticed, no, they're still too big. So I had to constantly shrink them down in width. So let's do that here right now too. Let's go with a 0.02 or something. So the thing that nature is doing with the spiders, of course, is they don't want insects to see those webs. That's why they like almost invisible. And so that's the key thing to do spider webs in reality, or to come over with that in 3D is to do the same thing. So normally, as a 3D artist, you want to make the people look at something and say, see what I did? It's cool, it's looking cool. But with spider webs, it's actually the other way around. You can make them almost invisible, but then that's the point where they start to look cool. And if I did everything right, you can see the dust particles on there. So, of course, right now, you can vary that dependent on your view, on your angle of view. And there's some other thing that I want to mention here. So right now I'm getting those strange behaviors at the end of the spider webs. It might look cool as the spider might, maybe you can sell it, the spider want to attach the web somewhere, but in reality that's not the way it is. So I just noticed that this effect comes from the cups. So if you turn that off, you get rid of those artifacts, so to speak. So right, so we've just 10 minutes left. So I'll just show you the keys short again. And after that, if you have any questions related or not related, you can ask them. All right, let's dive in for one more presentation of keys. Now let's turn up the audio again. All right. Thank you. So let's go back to our presentation because I have an extra question chart here. Okay. So has anyone any questions? Yeah. The question was if I could talk about the translucent key materials from the last shot. And maybe, yeah, there's actually some time left, so why not? So let's do that. Hopefully not ruining any plans. So let's go back to Cinema 4D. Oh, I already closed it, but why not reopening it? So actually, let me talk about a bit about this. So it's rather simple. So I had this material, this texture of marble, and I used this texture to make parts of the key translucent and parts of the key not translucent. And the translucent parts then go into subsurface scattering. But maybe I can show it. I'm not sure if I have the textures here, but I can maybe improvise something. So let's just take that one, that key, then create a, let's go over to Octane. And actually, I want to have the compact version here. Right, OK. So let's make a environment to have some lighting, and let's choose some textures. Right, this will do. So here we go. We have our key in Octane. Let's make a material, and I actually used the specular material. So you know me. I like to dive in the nodes. Here we go. And to make the key transparent and not transparent is rather easy. You can do that using a mixed material, but I just did it within one material. And let's just go and get the, where is it? Render settings to standard. I've made a preset. Here we go. Just reload the key. Now it's transparent. OK. So there in the material, there's the settings where you can change the transmission, so the strength of the transmission. So if I dial it down to 0, what did I do wrong here? It should become like that, black. So somehow there's a bug where you have a complete 0 in there. It turns out to be 100%. Have to let the toy guys know. But you can also create a texture to do that. So I'll just real quick go ahead and create an image texture. And I'm not sure if I have a marble here. I guess not. So I just take one of the textures that I have. Like maybe just use Cornelius's texture. It's an 8K texture. So let's set it to float because it's black and white. And I also, as always, get a gradient in between there to have more control. So let's stick it to transmission, and let's see what it's doing. So it gives me those occluded parts. Obviously, I want to have more occlusion. So I get that one here. And for better visibility, I'll just turn off the background for the render. Let's just go and scroll down here. Pre-multiply alpha and turn on. So here we go. So you can just see the key. Now, the other thing I did was obviously turn up the roughness a little bit. So you already get some sort of that look. And the last thing I did was added subsurface scattering inside of the key. So to do that, the best thing is to get your fake shadows on. So let's make a fake shadows tick here. Here we go. And then just create a subsurface scattering medium. Here we go. And obviously, that takes in some textures or floats. So I just quickly create some float for the absorption. The absorption should be rather high because we don't want to have that much absorption. And then we have a scattering here also. Here we go. And you can see the key is already getting milky. And we can increase this effect, obviously, by raising that value. So right now, it's not exactly the same effect, but it's mostly because of the texture that's different. But you can see that we get now this effect that some parts of the key are translucent with subsurface scattering, and some other parts are whole, like some other parts are not. So let me just go back in there. Sort of lost my node tree. I'm not getting it. But anyway, you get the idea. It was just a quick demonstration of how I did the translucency. All right, so we still have a couple of minutes, so are there any more questions? No? Oh, yeah, one. Well, for the question was for the explosion. How did I control the explosion? Actually, it was just trial and error. There's no speed up. There's just the camera zooming out after a while. So maybe if you want to have a speed ramp in there, normally I would go into the dynamics. I just create a dynamics tag. No, actually it's inside of the render settings. Let me just find them here. Come on. Normally it should be there. Anyway, so if you go into your global dynamics settings, there's a time parameter. It's set to 100%. Project settings, yeah. So, yeah, I tried it. It's not working, so I don't know. But if you go to your project settings, you can animate this parameter. So you could just start it rather fast and then just pull it down from 100% to 50% and then cache that out. But for me, I just tried like 100 different simulations until it looked good, and then I just cached that one, and that's the one you saw in the film. All right, so I think we have to switch now. So thank you, everyone, for coming, for asking questions, and for having stuff seen here on the screen. Thank you, Internet.